morning, everybody. Welcome into today's edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Keely Nix here with Michael Vincent.
Yes, welcome everybody. Thursday, just a few days till F3. We're getting really, really excited here and amped up. The energy in the room is palpable, actually.
Feel it.
Anyways, we're going to have a great show for you today, including Tony Mulvey and Kevin Hills on the spot segment. We also have another Wasson versus Vincent, that'd be me, and a roundtable on the latest events. But first, our top story deals with Wall Street and new indications that the markets might be turning a bit bearish on the transportation industry. Joining us now in studio is my good friend and strategic analyst, J.P. Hampstead, with more on the subject. What's going on, my friend?
We've just been following the Q3 earnings announcements. It's really exciting. Obviously, a lot of mixed results. A couple of important early misses. I think everyone talked about FedEx and the new CEO Subramaniam, who kind of blamed their earnings miss on the macro economy. And a lot of people were like, oh, maybe you're just you're new on the job. Maybe you're just not doing so great of a job running FedEx, but then Knight-Swift, the largest truckload carrier in North America, and one run by a management team that has a kind of impeccable reputation as very clean and efficient operators, also missed, right? And Dave Jackson kind of said there's not going to be a peak season in Q4, and so there's been a raft of notes coming out just sort of saying we actually expect things to get worse in 2023 than in 2022. Jefferies has a new transportation equities analyst, Stephanie Moore. She initiated coverage on a bunch of stocks earlier this week, and they're calling for a kind of a energy relief rally in GDP.
Okay.
So this morning, so we had 2 quarters of negative GDP.
Yeah.
This morning comes out 2.6% growth. Okay. She thinks another quarter of that will happen, and then the real recession starts.
So why this like fake spring or whatever, fake summer, fall summer, whatever you want to call it? Why this quick rebound for 2 months? What is that energy?
So I included the chart in the article, but it's basically just has to do with I think falling energy prices or.
Oh, I got you. Yeah,
but
we've got a bit of inflationary coming down a little bit, right? Is that part of pumping into that?
That is correct, but she thinks that the policies that the Fed has taken to raise rates and to kind of lower consumer demand will inevitably cause a recession next year. So she's basically saying. Negative GDP growth is not going to be good for transportation and logistics stocks, no matter how you cut it. She was pretty bearish. Other analysts, cutting price targets. I think it's important to remember that the impact of these different modes has been, sort of uneven, right?
Yeah, sure. It has. I mean, I was going to say that early on, J.B. Hunt came out with a pretty decent quarter, right? And everybody's like, oh, wow. But people who are kind of casual fans of transportation don't understand that they don't kind of fit into that Knight-Swift model.
Right.
Not the same animal.
Intermodal contract rates are not as volatile as truckload, which they pointed out on the call. They've leaned very heavily into dedicated specifically, so they added 1,700 trucks. Ahead of plan, which I think they had only planned for 1,000 to 1,200. So they're sort of more on the safe side. But they're also cutting CapEx. J.B. Hunt is. John Kulo, their chief financial officer, said that their original plan was to spend about $1.5 billion this year. They spent about $1 billion so far, and he was like, "We're not going to hit $1.5 billion." So you can tell even J.B. Hunt, which had a great quarter, is kind of trimming the sails.
Well, even in their earnings release when they talked about it, they said we're not so positive going into the fourth. Right. Or they said we're cautionary.
Yeah, definitely. Word of the day is cautious on guidance. People don't want. People are trying to manage expectations and make sure that investors and shareholders know what kind of environment they're going into.
Right.
That's a good point that you bring up, that right, kind of trying to manage your expectations. And obviously the largest truckload carrier, United Swift side of things, they've got a little bit more insulation to protect them and keep them like realistic, I would almost call it, moving through the upturn in GDP, right? Some of these smaller groups, what type of insulation do they need to build to actually truly prepare for the recession that now seems like it's imminent?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that in terms of like the broader transportation industry, the most challenged providers would probably be your mid-sized brokerages that have heavy spot exposure. I think that a prolonged downturn will eventually make the mega carriers, the mega asset-based carriers, kind of focus on asset utilization, on filling their trucks. They're not going to worry so much about maximizing yield on every load, and there will be a ferocious competition for freight, driving both contract prices and spot prices down. I just think that if as a broker you haven't built up the capability to service contract freight well, to kind of stay ahead of your scorecards internally, know how your shippers are going to be looking at your performance, if you're not ready to kind of take on those big tranches of freight, then you're going to be kind of fighting for scraps.
Mm-hmm.
How impactful is the entire world economy on what is going on here, and what is going on here impacting the rest of the world economy, right? We've got a little bit of inflation coming down right now in the U.S., up in Europe.
Yeah, it's super impactful. I mean, one of the best performing rail commodities this year has been coal, right? Wheat has been another one. So like two of the core things that America produces and that we export, energy and food, have done really well, surprisingly. And coal has been something that's been like a secular decliner for decades, and it's been outperforming this year, which is super interesting. So I think that matters a lot. I think the automobile industry, if you look at East Coast ports like Norfolk, Charleston, places where European cars come into the country, you might see impacts there if energy prices get so high in Germany that, for whatever reason, production is constrained.
Yeah. What about the whole reshoring movement, right? The reaction to COVID and the pandemic and changing up your supply chains, et cetera, your supply chains. Going into the recessionary, you mentioned like J.B. Hunt is they're pulling back on their CapEx, right? Does this recession and the preparation for that kind of delay some of those corrections to supply chains, or is that an investment that you're going to have to make anyway? So
I think that's going to have to be made anyway. I think that if you look at all of the moves that the U.S. government has been making toward China recently, both with like the CHIPS Act, getting a little bit tougher on Taiwan, but also just trying to figure out what it's going to look like if we have to build a tech economy that's completely separate. I think that that kind of divergence is baked in, but I wouldn't necessarily expect all of this manufacturing to return to the United States. Right. It makes me really bullish on Mexico, for example.
Yeah, right. As Mr. Daniel Stanton called it, somewhere else shoring.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so if you look at Kansas City Southern, if you look at Transplace, if you look at companies that have really big Mexico networks, I would expect them to do well.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
So, JP, then after we get into kind of the start of next year, a lot of folks are saying, well, we're kind of waiting to put together expectations for 2023 based on what Q4 2022 brings us. Do you have any expectation for coming into this true peak season, not peak season that we're going to see?
This peak season, I think it's going to be pretty muted, right? There's a lot of capacity. There's a lot of inventory. I don't expect shippers to be frantically moving, projects across country at the last minute. They shouldn't be, right?
Yeah, right.
At this point. As far as 2023 goes, I think there are two schools of thought. One is that the Fed will cause a recession, that raising rates this high, will have these knock-on effects. The other one, though, is that because of the constraints that the OEMs face on truck production, that the next capacity crunch is kind of baked in. That whatever, and Doug Wagner, the CEO of Echo Global Logistics, was the first person to bring this up to me. Other people have since then. But the idea is that, things may be in now, but the next time there is some important external event that shakes things up, and we've seen all of these over the past few years, there won't be enough. There won't be a way for big carriers to add capacity. We're running a structural shortage of trucks. Orders never actually made up the ground that they lost, and that the next crunch is baked in. Whether that happens in the middle of next year or second half of next year, who knows?
Your buffer is getting really, really thin on either side.
Yeah, and so I think that's an interesting school of thought. It really kind of just does depend on I think what the economy does. I mean, I think some people are making a mistake of underestimating how ferocious this recession or down cycle for transportation could be. I think people forget that in 2019, which was a really bad year for trucking. Lots of bankruptcies. The economy was doing okay then.
The two markets aren't the same.
The two markets aren't the same, but when they overlap, like in 2018, we had tight trucking and we had hot macro, and that combined for soaring rates, right? If we get loose trucking with soft macro or a cold economy, that could send things
exacerbates
even lower than 2019.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah.
All right, JP, thank you for coming in and joining us this morning. Of course, we can find your article up on freightwaves.com if you want more information on that. Right now, we're going to head on over to The Wall. We've got our first carrier update of the morning. Thomas Wasson is in for Donnie Gilbert today, and he joins Tony Mulvey.